Let's remind ourselves of where we came from, or what we've done last week. We started looking at Old Testament narratives, the great stories of the Bible, and we shared a little bit about what some of our favorite stories were and how powerful they are in helping us to understand the work of God. And we said that some of the means by which God has communicated with us is through stories, and that narrative really is God's word to us. It's not just historical truths, but His word to us today. And we saw that narrative works on a variety of levels, that the whole Bible is in a sense a narrative. It's a story being told. Then there's the story of a nation, the story of Israel within that big story. And then within the nation there are individual stories of individual people who make up the story of the nation of Israel as a whole. And we saw that there's two movements of story in the Old Testament. The ones that lead up to David and Solomon, and the ones that go from David and Solomon. And the one is largely positive and the other is largely negative. Right, let's go to our notes for today on page, well, I don't know, my page numbers are different to yours?
52.
Page 52. Read in context is our second heading. I'm just going to close the door here. It's pretty cold. Let's remind ourselves in those first few points how a narrative must not be taught. This is a little bit of going over what we did last week. I think it's so important. We usually mistreat narrative in these ways more than any other way. And here's a few things to keep in mind. As we approach narrative, it must not just be used as a source for good illustrations. Okay, that's the first point. Narrative is not just a source for good illustrations. Now, Peter's hoping you've got his notes for him. Joe? Peter behind you?
I gave him his notes too. That you gave me last week.
There he is, tell him.
Then my mouth. I got it from Michael last week.
Who are you confusing? Lou.
There's nothing going on here.
I've got another. Okay? I've got another set if it's easy.
No, I've this notes.
The case of the missing notes. Okay. Firstly then, on those notes, narrative is not just a source for good illustration. Let's imagine that you are teaching James chapter 2 verse 1. Imagine that you've got to a Bible study, or you're perhaps preaching a sermon, and James chapter 2 verse 1 is your passage. There it says, "My brothers, as believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, don't show favoritism." Favoritism is mentioned in James chapter 2 verse 1. The only time we ever teach the Old Testament ought not just to be when we use it as an illustration for something like favoritism. What's the great story of favoritism in the Old Testament? Joseph. His father? Who? Jacob. Joseph's father Jacob had a soft spot for Joseph and gave him a gift. Do you remember this? The multicolored coat. Joseph in his technicolored dream coat. He showed favoritism to his son. That ought not to be the only time we ever mention the story of Joseph, just as an illustration for something else. We must make sure we teach the story of Joseph in that account also. Or James chapter 3 verse 16, just as another example of that, where it says, "For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice." Jealousy that James mentions there is very much prevalent also in the story of Joseph. His brothers were jealous of him. we mustn't just teach the story of Joseph as an illustration for New Testament truths, but be willing and make sure that we do teach Old Testament stories in their own right, just focusing on that story. Secondly, narrative is not just there to provide examples of the consequences of obedience and disobedience. To use the story of Joseph again. Our teaching of that story ought not just to go like this. Look how godly Joseph was. Look how God exalted him. As a consequence of his obedience, God blessed him. Our teaching ought to go further than that. Nor should we just say, look how Jacob the deceiver is himself deceived. What goes around comes around. Jacob deceived Isaac, and now his own sons deceive him by saying that Joseph was eaten by a wild animal. So our teaching of stories must go deeper than this, than just those shallow levels of using them as illustration or as examples. And thirdly, narrative is not just there to teach good morals. It's not just there to teach good morals. Joseph was a good man. Joseph fled from his seducer. Joseph did not seek revenge. So we need to go further than just looking at Old Testament characters as examples of morality. We need to go deeper than that. Because there's a very real danger in teaching narrative in these bad ways, or using them just for those ends. There's two dangers that I mentioned there on your notes, A and B. The first is that we might, if we teach the Old Testament in those ways, give people a license to sin. That's the first danger, a license to sin. If we teach the Old Testament characters as those who provide moral direction to us, what do we do when those characters go off course? Now, what do we do if we are using Abraham as an example of good morality when he lies about Sarah and says she is his sister? Or when Jacob deceives Isaac, what do we do at that point? We can't use him as an example. Now follow Jacob. We might try and use the Old Testament to justify our own immoral practices. We might say something like, David was a man after God's own heart, but he messed up, and God still used him, so it's okay for me too to mess up. Well, it is okay to mess up. You know what I mean, don't you? God doesn't demand perfection from us, and we can never achieve it anyway. But we shouldn't accept, oh well, that's just his time of messing up. As if it's an acceptable thing to do. We should seek not to mess up. So we don't want to use the Old Testament characters as a license to sin. We can be grateful that God doesn't demand perfection, but we should nevertheless strive for it. I don't think that's as big a danger, though, as the second one. Here is the very great danger that Old Testament narrative presents us with, and I think this is all too common, and I'd urge you to take really careful notice of this. We can, if we teach the Old Testament incorrectly, burden people with law. Why do you think so many children leave Sunday school never to return again? I'm sure there's all sorts of answers. But by and large, in Sunday school, let's imagine Sunday school being your primary school years of 5 to 12. What are you mostly taught in Sunday school? I reckon Old Testament narrative. Old Testament narrative stories. Maybe the stories of Jesus also. But mostly you're taught stories because children respond very well to stories. But if they have been taught from those stories just to be good, rather than to trust Jesus who makes them good, then when they leave and realize that they are not good, they won't know what to do because they haven't been told about Jesus. So you learn from Joseph how to be sexually pure and non-violent. You learn from him to be a hard worker. You learn from him to be devoted to your family. your Sunday school teacher might tell you. And then when you can't do those things yourself, the teenager who can't be sexually pure, non-violent, or hard worker, or devoted to his family. I mean, think of a teenage boy at that point. How many teenage boys do you know who are sexually pure, non-violent, hard-working? It becomes quite amusing, don't you think? And who are devoted to their families. Most teenage boys are the exact opposite. Sexually impure, very violent, lazy as anything, hate their families. And when they realize that they can't be like Joseph, and they can't, they throw in the towel rather than turn to Christ, because their Sunday school teaching was inadequate. And maybe some of you went through something like that. You were given, you thought that Christianity was about perfection or about morality. And then you went through it for a time, you realized you can't do it. But you didn't know what to do because no one had ever told you about Jesus. Until you found Jesus. Only then could you understand that your immorality could be forgiven. So if we teach the Old Testament incorrectly, we will burden people with law. We will make them think that to be right with God, you need to be good. Rather than to be right with God, you need to turn to Jesus. So let's be very careful that we don't burden people with law keeping from the Old Testament stories. Right, so now I'm going to give you a little exercise to work on with your friend first, next to you. Here's the question: what problems might arise from the following sermon based on the story of Joseph, which is Genesis 37 to 50? I'm going to preach the sermon for you. I want you to be quite clear. This is a bad sermon. Okay, don't write notes now and say you're going to borrow this one for Sunday. And then say, Michael at the Entrust gave me the sermon to preach. Here's the sermon. It's going to last about 1 minute. Okay, it's a brilliant sermon. It's really short. Okay, today's sermon from the story of Joseph. It's called Integrity Under Fire. Because we all go through times when we are under fire, and we need to learn to be people of integrity when those times come. My first point is that when your integrity comes under fire, in the form of immorality, you must flee immorality. Dear brothers, especially the brothers, I want you to learn from Joseph that he fled from Potiphar's wife when she enticed him. Do you flee from the woman in your life who you should be fleeing from? Or are you accepting their visitations? Joseph says flee immorality. My second point I want to urge is to be people of integrity in terms of work. I want to urge you as Christian brothers and sisters to work hard. Pharaoh assigned a task to Joseph, and he worked hard at it, so much so that he fed the world. I mean, in your job, do you work so hard that you could achieve anything like that? Work hard, seek greatness, and make sure that you do what you're told to do. Don't be lazy. The third thing I want to encourage you to do is to forgive others. The story of Joseph tells us that we ought to be forgiving people. For the brothers of Joseph mistreated him terribly. Who do you need to forgive in your life? Okay, it's a great sermon, don't you think? It's powerful, it's moving, everyone feels convicted. Who doesn't feel that they have been immoral in their lives? I mean, everyone's going to feel bad. Everyone can do better. Who needs to work harder? Who hasn't been prone to laziness in one area or another? Everyone needs correction on that. And who doesn't need to forgive someone? Everyone does. So it sounds like a great sermon. I want you to talk to the person next to you and ask each other seek the answer to that question. What problems might arise from that sermon? And preaching like that might continue for some time. Have a thought of that with the people around you.
Because in ourselves, Jesus, who says, basically, it's us
Okay, let's have some thoughts from you. Don't want to spend all our time just on observing the problems. We want to get around to doing something worthwhile in a minute. But what do you think some of the problems might be? Certainly over a prolonged period of time from this type of preaching. Maybe all the problems won't arise just from one sermon, but over a prolonged period. Before you answer, let me ask you, have you heard sermons like that?
Yes.
Okay. Plenty. And do you think they would be popular?
Yes.
Today I learned, or more accurately, today my husband learned how not to be immoral. Do you think wives want their husbands to hear that? Absolutely. And men, are helped to hear that themselves. Today I heard some good tips about business management. Joseph worked hard. I learned things today. I'm going to make more money this way. And so it's going to be very popular. Okay, so what are some of the problems with it?
There's no mention of Jesus.
Okay, that's the big obvious one. I think Jesus is just omitted. It's all about Joseph, all about Joseph and me. It's all about Joseph and me, and I'm not learning specifically about Jesus. We'll see in a few minutes how we could learn about Jesus. We're going to do an exercise, hopefully more helpfully. Okay, Even God as a whole, God, the God of the Old Testament, doesn't even get the mention. Again, it's all about Joseph. Okay, another problem?
Also focuses on things that we need to do, so it's work-based. So you get the idea that you need to do that to be good. It doesn't focus on what God does for us.
Yeah, so it's not focusing on what God has done or is doing in the story of Joseph. It's jumping straight to what we need to do today. Are those things that Christians need to do?
Yes.
Okay, they are true. Okay, it's not heresy. The sermon's not heresy. It's just not Genesis 37 to 50. They are true Christian things, but we're not learning about God, we're learning about self. Yep. Naveni?
I actually think it's a very bad sermon in that it misses the point and places the emphasis in the wrong place. And that it is all about redemption and being in the right relationship with the Lord.
Right. That is a big problem. It's missing the point of Genesis altogether. It's not telling us the way of redemption. I'm sorry, I tried hard to write a good sermon, Naveni. I tried really hard. Yes, no, this is a very bad sermon, you're right. Some other points.
It tells
Michelle.
us what to do, but it doesn't tell us how. It just says do this and this and this.
Right.
Without the question, how do I do it?
Yeah, how do I do it? What would the answer be?
Trust rely on Jesus because he's already done.
Right, so because we haven't taught Jesus, we also haven't told people the means by which anything can ever be done. Okay? Other problems?
The end point is hopelessness.
Yeah, you will be hopeless because you will have failed on those points, and it's like a big stick has come across your back. The preacher has beaten you. You feel defeated, and you go home and you say, "Oh, what's the point?" Next.
And Joseph is the hero, not God.
Yep, Joseph, hero, the focus, not the one who's meant to
It doesn't
be.
really say why to be moral.
Good, yeah.
It's like a presumption.
Why must you be moral? Why must you work hard? Yeah.
Or this
Yeah.
thing.
Okay, good. Anything else?
It doesn't acknowledge God's control, like the brothers mistreating Joseph. It was all part of God's plan.
Right. So Joe says it doesn't acknowledge God's control. That presumes now that you know a part of the story. So obviously you know some of the story. Which means then what you're actually saying is that the Joseph story hasn't been taught as part of the whole. So you've got 3 incidents from the Joseph story that have been brought out because the preacher likes them or they're going to make a good sermon. And he hasn't kept those in mind as being part of the whole. Do you remember last week we spoke about the top level, middle level, bottom level? So he's taken 3 bottom level stories, all of them true, but he hasn't kept in mind that they make up the middle level, the whole story of Joseph and the movement of God's people. Okay, so they're just random scattered thoughts. Next.
Behavior modification. It's not. So it's. I don't know. Like that's kind of the focus. We want our people to be good people. It's not. We want to explain salvation.
Yes.
And that's like the emphasis of is change your behavior.
Yeah. Change your behavior rather than find salvation in Jesus and live for His glory. We do want people's behavior to be changed. I want to be more godly today than I was last year. But the means of it is not through me just, pull up my socks a little bit higher. It's about me trusting Jesus, knowing Jesus more, loving Jesus more. Trusting and knowing His Word. Okay, nothing about God or Jesus, nothing about what God was doing through Joseph, that bigger picture of the story, nothing about the central truths of the story, just random scattered thoughts, leaves lots out. This type of preaching will leave out all the difficult bits. So if every week it's just a few little bits and pieces from your favorite stories, you can be quite sure the preacher or the teacher is going to leave out the parts that are hard or awkward or difficult. So this morning I was doing narrative, New Testament narrative, granted, but do you think preachers really want to preach about Ananias and Sapphira? I mean, I could happily have left that out and rather gone on to another passage that talks about the growth of the church in Acts that comes about through the preaching of the Word, not through the discipline of God. It's not easy to do that because, to tell people that God is a God of judgment is not always what people want to hear. But if I want to be faithful to the text, I have to preach it. And if I'd skipped that part this morning, you could have said to me, well, last term you ended off in chapter 4. Why have you skipped the beginning part of chapter 5? It provides an appraisal that is not useful for the Christian life. That appraisal is perfection. This is what you must strive towards. That's just not true. The overall story is not considered. And there is application without explanation. So yeah, you guys covered all of that in your thoughts. Now what we're going to do is to work out how narrative should be taught. And we're going to turn to Genesis 37 to 50. And hopefully you and your friends are able to work together at answering those questions. So we're going to take a few minutes to do this. Work steadily through those questions. You won't be able to do number 1. And that's a terrible thing that we won't be able to do number 1. You must always do number 1. Summarize the events in the story, in the narrative. The great danger with Old Testament stories is that you think you know the story. You presume. I say Joseph and you say a few things in your mind, okay, wasn't he the one who did this, and this, and that's all true, but there might be big things that you've missed out, or maybe you just never heard one part of it. So you need to know the story well. But for today's purposes, as sinful and as wrong as it is, we're not going to do number 1 because it will take you too long. Those 14 chapters will take too much time. But that's where we begin. We need to know what happens in the narrative. And then afterwards, answer these questions. Are these events explained anywhere? Is there something in the text that tells us this is what the Joseph story is about? Because that is what the story of Joseph will be about. Then you won't have to work it out for yourself. I love those verses. When I find a verse that tells me what something is about, I stop quietly and I say, thank you, Lord, that I don't have to think. Jesus told a parable. He said, this parable is to encourage people to not give up praying. And then he told the parable of the persistent widow. What do you think the parable of the persistent widow is about? Jesus says it's a parable about not giving up to pray. Do you know what me as the preacher thinks? I didn't have to work it out. So you're looking in the story for a verse, a section that tells you, this is what I want you to learn in the Joseph story. And there's 3 wonderful verses. Maybe you know them already. And number 3, how does the narrative begin and end? How does the story of Joseph begin? How does the story of Joseph end? Stories often work like that the beginning and the end match one another because it's a conclusion. How does this help us to understand the message of the narrative? Number 4, apply the principles of top, middle and bottom narrative levels to the story of Joseph. How might this help you to determine the message of the narrative? That's what we did last week. And again, you'll have to be brief on that one. Number 5, how does this teach you about God? What does this teach you about God? So overall thrust, hear about Him. And then number 6, how does this point us to Jesus? So it's not just a story about Joseph. Okay, so 3s and 4s work together, and we'll take about 10 minutes to do that. Go to it, Rochelle. Yeah, question.
Number 2, do you want us to explain how the events are explained within Genesis or references outside of Genesis?
So number 2, are these events explained anywhere? Yes, stay in the story.
In the story. The
story will tell you what the story means. Okay, so let's get to it. We'll take about 10 minutes to do it. Actually, we'll take a bit longer, probably about 15 minutes. The class is going to get on and do their work now, and please take the time, even if you're watching YouTube now, or the guys who are watching live, just stop for a few minutes and do what they're doing also, and see how your answers compare with the class's answers in a few minutes' time.
Joseph
What's top?
This is
But it's also a story of fulfillment.
Goes to
God
God.
said this is going to
Like that God said.
starting in
So again, it's a warning.
So Exodus 1 explains how the one of these is Joseph. So it seems So where does the story relate to the past? Okay, let's talk about the middle bit. So in the story there's a time slavery, we are leaving the story of Israel. As Joseph returns to the story of Israel. Yeah, it's just before slavery, isn't it? Or is it got slavery? You have a handful of Jake and God has Joseph slavery. Isn't it? So that's so we fit it in just before slavery in Egypt.
Command the doctrine at the top and middle, so 1, 2, 3. So up here, we've got the
Yes. Because they're not under the Pharaoh, so they're not. It's just entry.
What is
Entry into the situation.
people always respond to acting
So
even Brother Andrew says that God's mind can be saved.
that's the beginning of the next thing. So that's what in the promise of
What is she saying?
so we're in that school, it's trust us, the promise of rescue, under the top of the promise of rescue.
Righto, let's hear some answers. What did you come up with? We said we won't be able to do the first one, but I hope you know the story of Joseph may be better than some of your Old Testament stories. Number 2 asked, are these events explained anywhere? Give me some key verses that might do that. There are some verses in the story of Joseph that might be quite well known. Certainly when I tell you what they are, if you don't know what they are, we'll kick ourselves and know them. Who came up with one?
We said 45.
Good. 45 verse 5. That's the first one I've got. Genesis chapter 45 verse 5. Read it for us, Darren.
And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for sowing me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you.
Okay, so Joseph speaks to his brothers and he tells them what the purpose of these events are. Do not be angry with yourselves for sending me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It's a verse that tells you the purpose of the Joseph events. This is not just random events, but God was at work, the saving of people's lives. Verse 7 also, God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So God still has in mind his promises to Abraham, the saving of his own people. Who's got another verse, the most well-known verse of them all?
Another verse, well known, but 50 verse 19.
Yep. Chapter 50.
Yeah.
50 verse 20, do you mean? 19:20.
21.
Joseph said to them, don't be afraid, am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Those 3 verses really tell you what's going on in the story of Joseph. God is at work. What is God doing? He's saving lives. How is he doing it? Through Joseph. He has appointed Joseph for a specific task, and he is working things out to that specific end. They're not just random events. They are specific for a specific task. Now, if you go and forget that that is what the story of Joseph is about, you might land up teaching the smaller parts of the story in an unhelpful way. You must have that in your mind as you're looking at the story of, say, Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And so, right, how is this story building on or part of that overall goal that God has, namely the saving of lives through Joseph? Now, those are the verses for which you thank God, and then you remember them. You don't find them and then forget about them. You keep on testing everything that you teach by those verses. Am I straying off in a different direction, or is my teaching in line with those verses? Right, number 3 asks, how does the narrative begin and end? And how does this help us to understand the message of the narrative? How does it begin and end?
Start with Joseph in Cape Town. Cape Town?
Joseph, I don't think, spent time in Cape Town.
Canaan and ends up in Egypt.
Starts in Canaan, ends in Egypt. Okay, that's quite general. Anyone got something really specific?
Starts with the dream of his brothers and parents bowing down to him, and it ends with that actually happening.
Great. So have a look at chapter 37 and verse 5. Remember that stories often begin and end in a particular way. You know, you might say, Michael dreamed of playing rugby for the Springboks, and as a small boy collected all their memorabilia and all the jerseys and all the balls and all, you know, talk like that. And then what could you imagine the last scene of that story being? Michael holding up the World Cup trophy or something. You know, look, he's realized his dream. The story begins and ends in the same way. Along the way, there might be other things like, you know, Michael has a terrible car accident and spends 3 months in hospital. And that would be part of the overall story. Can he come back to rugby after this? So it's got nothing to do with anything, but yesterday I watched a schoolboy break his leg on the rugby field. Did you see it? A YouTube clip. It was the most horrific thing you can imagine. He basically developed 2 knees. His leg went in a Z. It halfway down, it just bent at right angles. It was the poor ref and the players were all. Oh, it was a terrible thing to see. Anyway, that's a rugby story. Chapter 37, verses 5 to 11. Chapter 37, 5 to 11, Joseph is dreaming. And he's dreaming about his brothers bowing down to him. The end of the story, chapter 50 and verse 18. Chapter 50, verse 18. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him, as they had already done, saying, "We are your slaves." They've done so throughout the story, chapter 42 and 43 also. Now clearly God has brought about this bowing down to Joseph. So when you're reading stories, look out at the beginning and at the end to see if there's something of similarity. Because here's the introduction, the conclusion. Here's the thing around which the story is working. The other parts are going to be leading towards that end. Number 4, I asked you to apply the principles of top, middle and bottom narrative levels to the story of Joseph. It's a long exercise, like the first question about summarizing the events. The top level you should know fairly well by now. The Bible tells the story of creation and fall, salvation and new creation. That's the easy one, really. There's a middle level, the story that focuses on Israel, with the promises to Abraham, their time in Egypt, the Exodus, their rescue, how they enter the land, live in the land, are exiled from the land and return to the land. And this bottom level is made up of all the smaller stories like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now our story, Joseph. And we need to understand that all the other levels fall down if the Joseph story didn't happen. If Joseph did not bring about the saving of many lives, well, that would have been the end of God's people. They would have died of hunger and starvation, and that would have been the end of God endeavoring, or God keeping his promises to bring about blessing to the nations. But through Joseph, that is made possible. Joseph, by his mediation, if you like, brings about blessing to the nations as God raises him up to power. And so it shows us that God is sovereignly at work in caring for and saving his people. It's a story that reminds us of the Esther story. God saving his people. question 5, what did you say does the story teach you about God? Question 5, what does it teach us about God? He saves. Okay, that's an essential part. God is seeking to save people. He's a rescuing God. Yeah, something else?
He uses bad things for good outcome.
God is so powerful that He can use bad things to bring about good things. That really tells us that God is sovereign. The sovereignty of God ought to be very much in our minds as we read the story of Joseph. That through evil, God is at work to do good. God can work through the small things, the micro things, to achieve the big things, the macro things. Those little stories in the story of Joseph are important as they relate to the whole. Right, now what do we do with the story as we point people to Jesus in the story? What will be the helpful Christian applications to make from the overall story of Joseph? What did you say?
We know that our God says that He's the redemptive God, and that man is left his own devices, he is evil, man sins, so it's the fall, that He provides for redemption and eternal hope through Christ Jesus.
Okay, good. So God is a saving God and He redeems through Jesus. That's true. That we learn that to be true. Absolutely. Something else?
Also that man cannot keep the laws by himself. The story throughout the Old Testament.
Yeah, I think that's quite general, that man cannot keep the laws by himself. That is quite general. I don't think it's quite specific to this story of Joseph quite as much.
God's fulfilling His promises in getting the people into Israel, and He's leading us towards the fulfillment that He's promised.
Okay, God is fulfilling His promises to lead His people into the promised land, and He will fulfill His promises to us to lead us into the promised land. Okay?
Isn't it also, are we on question 6 here?
Yeah.
So the pointing to Jesus thing, is that not 49 and 10 where they talk about a king?
Good.
From the tribe of Judah, so pointing to Jesus.
That's right. Chapter 49 verse 10 reminds us. Oh, okay.
Scepter will not be far from Judah.
No, we can't from between His feet.
I think all's okay. I think they can hear, and I don't think they can see though, but they can hear. Yes, Tracy said, what about chapter 49 verse 10, which says that the scepter won't depart from Judah? So yes, the king will come from this family, and ultimately we know who that king is. He is King Jesus. Now, primarily we must remember Acts chapter 4 verse 25 to 28. Acts 4, 25 to 28, where in Peter's preaching, just after they healed the begging man at the temple in Jerusalem, he said that what happened to Jesus by Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Gentiles was under the plan of God. God chose for those things to happen. In other words, that Jesus' suffering was controlled by God. Just as Joseph's suffering was under the control of God for the good end of bringing about salvation to many. And as we think about the process of salvation for the people through Joseph, so we'll see that process of salvation through Jesus is very similar. So think about Joseph and Jesus. Both were rejected. Rejected by his brothers, rejected by his own people, Jesus. Joseph rejected by his brothers, Jesus rejected by almost everyone. Joseph was sold into slavery. Jesus was betrayed by Judas. Both were mocked. Joseph mocked for his dreams. Jesus mocked as he hangs on the cross. Both suffered tremendously at the hands of his brothers, suffered at the hands of the Jews and Gentiles. Both rose up to rule, though, despite their suffering. Joseph to second in charge. Jesus, in his resurrection, rules over all. And ultimately, as the ruler, Joseph saves people from hunger, and as the ruler, Jesus saves people from sin and judgment. And so the process of salvation between Joseph and Jesus is a mirror image. Rejection, betrayal, mocking, suffering, ruling, saving. But the problem for Joseph is that he is an incomplete ruler. He dies in Egypt, and he cannot save people from their heart's problem, their sinfulness. They need someone better. They need someone to whom they must bow. So the story of Joseph tells us the importance of bowing down for salvation. If you want to be saved from your hunger, you need to bow down to Joseph. If you want to be saved from your real enemies, you must bow down to someone. And who is that? Well, it is Jesus. Philippians chapter 2 says that every knee must bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And that's where that verse, Genesis 49 verse 10 comes in. You bow down to the one who has the scepter. You bow down to the one who is king. To benefit from this rescuer, you need to bow down to him. Okay, so do you see that it's treated now slightly differently than just flee from immorality, work hard, and what is the other one? Forgive others. Those are all important truths. They will have a place within the story of Joseph. But ultimately, we are to teach people about the sovereignty of God in suffering to bring about good. And ultimately, it points us to Jesus and his suffering that brings about rescue and salvation for all who bow down to him. Okay, what have we seen today? Some points of summary. 6 things to consider as we work on our study of narrative. Number 1, set the passage in its context. Remember that your story is part of a bigger story. Try and get to know the events of the story very well. Don't presume all the time that you know it well. Look for the explanation of those events. Try not to just presume that you know what the story means. Look for verses or paragraphs that will tell you what it means. Mostly look from within the story. Sometimes you might be helped to find the explanation elsewhere. But look for biblical explanation of the events. And when you do that, understand that this is what God is doing. He's giving you the event and the explanation, and that together, the event and the explanation, is called revelation. How does God reveal himself? Not just by the event, not just by words, but by those events being explained with words. That is the revelation of God. That will help you, number 5, to determine what is being revealed about God, and then to consider the natural links towards the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, do you have any questions from what we've done today? I'm trying to...
You've got a comment on the board from the screen, talking about Goshen and Egypt.
Yeah, that's where Joseph found himself. I think there's been a problem with our guys. I think the internet has gone down, so sadly they are not there at the moment. Welcome to South Africa. Okay, do you have any questions about what we've done today then? Yeah, Michelle.
So, number 4, you asked us to apply the principles at the top, middle, and bottom levels.
Yep.
I just wanted to ask, so the way we did it, we said the bottom level is Joseph's story. The
Yep.
middle is the blessings to other nations and meaning to descendants, and
Good.
the top is the beginning of the fulfillment of the Abraham covenant. Can it be done in that way?
Yeah, that's very helpful. So you're looking at how the promises are made and fulfilled at the different levels. That's perfect. Yeah, Navini?
I just wondered, but how does the 37 to 50, the story of Joseph, how does this throw light on the issue of predestination, God's plan of predestination?
Yeah, certainly it does. Acts chapter 4 says that God predestined the events of Jesus' life so as to do and achieve what he did. God is in control. That is what predestination says. Predestination revolves around the subject of the sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God means that he has planned for everything to happen. And there are no chance events with God. You've got to encourage people to remember that. Nothing takes God by surprise.
There's a question, but we go from 37 to 50. You get to 38 and it completely takes a short left and tells us about Onan and Judah and
Yeah.
what has that really got to do with Joseph's narrative?
Yeah, those are the questions. Those are the important questions that one asks when you see something like a section that is clearly beginning at 37, bowing down, clearly ending in 50 with bowing down, and then to try and plot how everything works together. So you've got this tension in the family. It's a picture of the breakdown of the family here, of Jacob's descendants. But here, out of that, God is bringing the good of raising up a rescuer in Joseph. Now, each of these individual stories can be taught and should be taught. We are not simply saying only ever teach these big overarching stories, like 13, 14 chapters at a time. We're not saying just do that, but we're saying you need to know the big story well before you can zoom in on the smaller accounts along the way. So by all means, teach about Joseph and Potiphar's wife, but you need to know how that is slotting into the overall story. Okay, well, next week we'll carry on with our narrative, study of narrative.